And what I want to do is, again, just briefly review the essential ideas of the last shiur and continue, especially for those perhaps who are not here, and I'm sure even for those who are here, that kind of review is also very good. If you recall, I said that the Yechidah of Adam Harishon, that is the Nishmas Mashiach. That is what's meant by the Mashiach. That Neshama, which basically is the Yechid of Adam Rishon, that's the Nishmas Mashiach. That is the Mashiachos. Now, that is the soul of the Mashiach. The Nishmas Mashiach, which is the soul of the Mashiach. Now, that splits, as I mentioned, and it splits into half, and each part descends on two different kinds of individuals on Neshama. So the Yechid of Adam Rishon, which is the Mashiachos, splits. One part goes for one individual, the other part goes for another individual. Now, last week I had used the example of land and trees growing out of it. I'll just use a different example just to give you perhaps a little better variety. The question, of course, is who does this Neshama or Yechidah, the Nishmas Mashiach, who does it devolve on? Who does it go upon? And the answer, of course, and the best way to look at it is look at the idea of a trunk or a tree that has a trunk and branches. Okay, you'll notice a tree, of course, it has a trunk and it has branches also, which emanate from the tree. Therefore, that is the metaphor, that's the best way of understanding the analogy, that the trunk represents a shirish, a root, shirish kloli, a general root. And the branches represent shirish prati, or individual roots that branch out from the shirish kloli. Now, one branch is in every generation, and also the trunk. Not in every generation, but it comes down once. For instance, or rather, what exactly happened? The trunk itself comes down once, and then leaves, and then thereafter a branch comes down from that trunk. You know, a neshama comes down which has embedded in it the shirish kloli, which is a trunk. And then throughout every generation there are branches that come down, or shroshim protium, or neshamas that have the particular shirish. They come down in every generation. Whether it be a trunk or that individual who has within him that neshama that's a shirish kloli, or if it be the individual that has the neshama, which is a shirish prati, each one can receive that yechidah from Adam Harishon. Each one of these people. Now, to be more concrete, one trunk is called the shirish kloli, or the neshama of the Mashiach Ben Yosef, and it gives rise to many different neshamas, each one being a shirish of that shirish kloli. So they are shirish prati, specific roots, because they emanate from the larger root, which is the trunk. And the Mashiach Ben Yosef, there is a trunk itself, who actually was Yosef HaTzadik. He was that shirish kloli. And the specific trunks, rather specific shroshim, these are different individuals born in every generation. There is one that is a shirish prati, okay, and whether it be Yosef or whether it be anybody else, as long as they come from that tree, they can receive the yechidah. They are the individuals who are roi, who are proper to receive the yechidah of Adam Rishon. This is the idea of Mashiach Ben Yosef, which I had spoken about last week. The same idea is Mashiach Ben David. That's another tree called Mashiach Ben David. Again, it's a trunk and its branches. The trunk is a shirish kloli, the stock, the main stem, and the branches are a shirish prati. And again, the trunk is, there's an individual who has an neshama who has that trunk, and that was Yehuda. That's how it started. And besides Yehuda, there's also branches. And of course that means there are individual neshamas who have the shirish prati. And these also are, of course, part of the inyan of the Mashiach Ben Yosef, because they all come from the same tree. Mashiach Ben David, because they all come from part of the same tree. Now, the yechidah can descend on any individual who is either the trunk or the branches of either tree. One half yechidah settles on some individual who is a Mashiach Ben Yosef, means somehow he comes from the Mashiach, he comes from the tree called the Mashiachus of Yosef, either the trunk or the branch, and one settles down on an individual who comes from the tree of Ben David, which means that it can settle down on any one of the branches, or individuals who are a branch, or the trunk, or the individual who is the main stem. This is basically what we had spoken about last week. And also that in each generation there's always a shiur of either Ben David and Ben Yosef in every generation. Now also what we had spoken about last week is that every neshama, whether it be a shiur kloli or a shiur prati, of either one, either Ben David or Ben Yosef, is somehow tied up in the tikkun, means the correction or the job or the task that the Mashiachim have to do. Whether they are the Mashiach or not doesn't make a difference. They are somehow tied up in whatever that trees have to do in terms of the correcting whatever was damaged in the Bria. This is all review. That's why I'm not really bothered to explaining it. I assume everybody understands this from last week and the weeks before. So therefore, each neshama, no matter if he's from any part of that tree, whether it be the trunk or the branch, okay, whether it be a shiur kloli, shiur prati, whatever he is, or whatever, their job is to masakin whatever the Mashiachus of Ben David or Ben Yosef has to masakin. Now, I also mentioned that the Yechida descends on those two neshamas, one on Ben David, the other on Ben Yosef, of the individuals who are mashlim the tikkun, those people who finally finish the job, because it builds. In that generation that the tikkun finally is completed, of whatever Ben Yosef and Ben David has to do, which I had mentioned, to masakin the kilkul or pagam of Adam Rishon as well as the Chassan, the original Chassan, these two individuals get the Yechida. That's the individuals who get the Yechida, because they are mashlim the long, difficult task of finally correcting that which has to be done. Okay, this is basically the review essentially of what I covered last week. We can go further now. Now, besides these ideas, we understand spiritually exactly what Mashiachs are all about, which is very important idea to understand. We understand exactly what the structure is of the spiritual essences of the Mashiach. The ideas of the Yechida, the ideas that there are two trees, each one doing a different function, the ideas that part of that tree there's a trunk and a branch, and no matter which one your neshama represents, you're involved in that task or job, which is tikkun of whatever you have to do. And that the last two shroshim that finally masakin this is the Mashiach, because they get the Yechida. This is what we see now. Now, it's important also to know that when finally the Yechida descends on these individuals, then the neshama of Yosef HaTzadik joins that shiur. In other words, the branch, when he finishes the tikkun, right? He finishes the job, whatever that is. And if the Yechida descends, what happens is that the neshama of Yosef, who is the trunk, merges with the branch. Okay? So in other words, the tree merges with its branch, and that individual is the Mashiach. In other words, when that shiur finally is going to get the Yechida, then he merges, because he's only a shiur prati, he's a branch, he merges with the original trunk. They mechaber, they become mischaber, they join or unite. Now, the same thing with David. When the individual who's going to be the Mashiach ben David, then his shiur unites with the trunk or David HaMelech. That's exactly the neshama of David HaMelech. That's who he unites with. So the individual who's the Mashiach, you're really looking at a neshama who has part of him, the neshama of Yosef HaTzadik in the case of the Mashiach ben Yosef. And when you look at the Mashiach ben David, if everybody's zeicha to, then you're looking at an individual who has part of him, the neshama of David HaMelech, is wrapped up in his neshama, because they come together. Now, what's the point, or why does this happen? Because it's the full merger of the tree, of the branch with its trunk, that gives the power to the individual branch to do its job. In other words, it's the neshama of Yosef and the neshama of David, in case of Mashiach ben Yosef and in the case of Mashiach ben David, that gives the power, the strength to do the Mashiachos, not the avoid of the Mashiachos, but the Mashiachos itself, which is the Mani Klal Yisrael, the Messiahship. So therefore, the Mashiach ben Yosef derives his strength, finally, from the unification of he and the Neshama of Yosef, and the Mashiach ben David derives his strength from the unification of his Neshama with David HaMelech. Really David HaMelech, and really Yosef HaTzadik. And then both of them actually can do their job, which I had outlined quite a while ago in the previous shiurim, the different tasks of the Mashiach ben David and the different tasks of the Mashiach ben Yosef when they become the Mashiach, which is different than before they become the Mashiach. Now, also it's important to understand that even if the shirish, or rather I say, even if the individual who's going to be the Mashiach has not been designated the Mashiach yet, means he doesn't have the Yechidah, but the fact that he's almost ready to receive the Yechidah means as the work gets more and more completed, when it's almost down to its end, then what happens is Yosef, the Neshama of Yosef HaTzadik, joins the Mashiach in a light fashion, slightly. It's almost like there's a hovering of Yosef next to the shirish of the Mashiach ben Yosef, who will get the Yechidah. That has tremendous repercussions through history because of this. As a result of that, the Neshama of Yosef HaTzadik comes close to the shirish of the Mashiach ben Yosef before, or just about before he's about to receive the Yechidah and become the Mashiach. That has tremendous implications in through history, as we shall see when I go back into Tanakh and history. Because right now, all I'm doing for this year and the last year is giving you a theoretical framework to understand the spiritual entities called the Mashiachos and what happens. And it's very important to understand, because then you understand history much better in terms of its pnimius. The same thing is with Mashiach ben David. Pnimius, in its internal design, intrinsic ideas of what's going on. Now, the same thing happens in the Mashiach ben David. Before the Mashiach ben David, or that individual who's a shirish to the Mashiach ben David, before he's about to become nismaneh, or appointed as a Mashiach, before he's about to have the Yechidah, then David HaMelech also hovers very close to him. And there's a certain joining, but it's not fast. There's a certain connection, but it's not the same, obviously, when they get the Yechidah. But again, there's a very close proximity of the neshamas. David with the Mashiach ben David, right before he's about to become that, and Yosef with the Mashiach ben Yosef, right before he's about to become the Mashiach. Therefore, now, in order to understand that, we understand that, therefore, with this explanation, we understand what the Gemara means when the Gemara alludes to David HaMelech as being a Nasi, a prince, and not just a Melech. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin which talks about, it says over there that Osir HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahamed David Acher. The Rebbeinu Shalom in the future is going to establish another David, the Gemara says there. And what that means is that David HaMelech, of course, will be connected with another individual who has the shirish of David, because David is the trunk, right? And he will give him the power to do his position. That's what it means. Therefore, of course, that individual, so therefore he's called David in that sense. So therefore, David, when he was a Melech, he was called a Melech. But David HaMelech, after he dies, the position of him is to give power to the Mashiach ben David, so therefore he's called a Nasi. That's why he's called a prince, not a Melech, because he gives the power of the Mashiach ben David to be manhig, to rule, to do his job. So therefore, that's what Chazal mean, that Osir HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahamed David Acher means that the Rebbeinu Shalom will make arise a Mashiach ben David, who will have Dover HaMelech as his source of power. Therefore, Dover HaMelech is then called a Nasi. That's why it says in Yecheskel, "But David Avdi Nasi Lohem Li'olam," and David, my servant, will be a prince to them forever. Well, he's not a prince; he's a Melech. What does Yecheskel mean? Because after he died, he's going to be a prince, not a Melech, because he is in the position of giving power to the Mashiach ben David. In that sense, he's a prince. The Gemara in Sanhedrin calls him a Palge Kesar, a viceroy. Dover HaMelech is a viceroy to the king, because his position again is to give power to the Mashiach ben David to do his position. Therefore, Dover HaMelech is called a Nasi in Yecheskel, and Gemara in Sanhedrin calls him a Palge Kesar, a viceroy. And it's the same thing with the Mashiach ben Yosef, the same idea, that Yosef is going to again give the power to the Mashiach ben Yosef to do his position. So he's also called a Nasi, and he's also called a Palgoy Kesar, half a Kesar. That's what it means, which means a viceroy. In other words, if one wants to understand it, what it simply means is that they will be the fathers of the two kings. The two kings will be the Mashiach ben David and the Mashiach ben Yosef, and they will therefore be Mani Klal Yisrael. They will lead Klal Yisrael, each one doing a different area. The Mashiach ben Yosef primarily concerned with the Or Rishon, means to Megala Torah, the pneumis of Torah, and the Mashiach ben David primarily concerned with making sure Klal Yisrael adheres to this Torah that they're learning. Two different kind of tasks. So therefore they are both Malachim. So therefore David and Yosef, both of them, the Neshamas, are an Ov L'Melech. They are fathers to the king. That's why they're called Nasiim. That's why they're called princes or viceroys, and they're not called kings, of course, in the Yemos Mashiach. And we understand this, just as an allusion, because it says in Oz Yoshia, which you daven every day, it says Va'olu Moshiim bihar Va'olu Moshiim Lishpoit is Har Esav, and there will arise saviors to judge the mount of Esav, V'hoyusul al Hashem Hamlucha, and the kingdom will be to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Why does it say Moshiim? It says Va'olu Moshiim Lishpoit is Har Esav. Who's going to judge the mountain of Esav? Means who's going to reckon with Christianity or Edom or whatever, Western civilization? It'll be Moshiim. Who are the Moshiim? Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef. That's why there's a plural. You'll always find there's a plural. When it says V'hatzo yili elef, and the V'hatzo yili godel, and the young one will be for a great one, and I don't recall the exact lashon of the pasuk, but in any case, again, you see always the two positions, because it's always referring to two Mashiachim, the Mashiach ben David and the Mashiach ben Yosef. The pasuk is v'hakotten yile elef v'hatzo yile godel. That's the pasuk, and the cotton, the minor, the child, yile elef will be for a multitude. And the young one, Yele God, will be for a great nation. And again, it's referring to the Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David, because when they start out small, and then of course they proliferate, their powers proliferate, until they finally develop into the idea of Mashiach. Now, to go weiter, so this is the idea so far of the Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David being mischaber with the neshama of Yosef and the neshama of David. And David and Yosef, of course, feed power to the Mashiachim themselves. Therefore, they are called Nasiim rather than Malachim. Okay? And the Malachim, of course, are designated as the Mashiachim themselves. It's important to understand. Now, many times you'll find that the Mashiach ben Yosef is called Ephraim. In fact, you'll find it says in Tanakh, it says, Haben Yake li Ephraim, right? And the one who's precious to me is Ephraim. And that's referring to Mashiach ben Yosef. You find that many times all over Nach, when it always says Ephraim, many, many times, it says Ephraim again and again. That Ephraim is the Mashiach ben Yosef. That's who Ephraim is. Many times in Medrash, you'll see it says Ephraim Mashiach Tzidki, my righteous Messiah, who is Ephraim. So we see that Mashiach ben Yosef is also called Ephraim. Mashiach ben Ephraim. But David, Mashiach ben David, is always called David. Mashiach ben David is not called by any other name except David. Whereas Mashiach ben Yosef is called by the name Ephraim also. So the question, of course, is why? Why is Mashiach ben David called David? And the Rai is the Gemara, which brings out the Pasuk, V'David Abdi Nasi, he'll be a Nasi, Lohem Li'olam, he'll always be a Nasi, and it's calling him, so David means, Li'olam Boer means that David will, in terms of Mashiach ben David. And the Gemara said, Asar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahamid, David Acher, doesn't say by another name. Whereas by Mashiach ben Yosef, you find him constantly referred to as Ephraim, not as Yosef. Sometimes the Tanakh especially refers to him as Yosef. But many times in Nach, you'll see, if you look at Haftarahs after the laning all the time, many times the Haftarahs refer to Ephraim, Mashiach Tzidki. So the question, of course, is why is he called Ephraim if he's really from Ben Yosef? Now, so in order to answer the question, we really have enough information previously. If you recall, I said that there's a trunk and a branch. There's a shirish kloli and a shirish prati. There are individuals who have the shirish kloli, like Yosef, Yehuda, David HaMelech, and there are individuals who have the shroshim of those general stems, and they're called, of course, the shroshim or the shirish prati. Now, if you recall, I said that Yehuda, because of his chet, and you recall what the chet was, that he gave advice to the other brothers to sell Yosef. Remember? He said, Ma betza, what do we profit? Let us sell him instead. That was a chet, because the brothers tied to him later. Had you told us to bring him back to his father, we would listen to you. So it comes out that Yehuda was actually responsible, of course, for Yosef being put into Mitzrayim. So Yehuda deposed Yosef from his melucha. That's really what it is. So as a result of that, it says, Vayered Yehuda me'es Echov. Right after the parsha of the Mechira, it says, and Judah descended from his brothers. So Chazal learn that Oved leHamalchus, Yerida Hoyseloi, he had a Yerida, he descended in Ruchnias. Oved leHamalchus, he lost the kingdom, the kingship. And what does that mean? It means that Yehuda had the trunk of the Mashiach ben David. That idea, the main trunk of the Mashiach ben David. He lost that. And it was given instead to David HaMelech. That's why we don't say Mashiach ben Yehuda, we say Mashiach ben David. Because we always refer to the one who has the main trunk. And in this case, David had it and it was taken away from Yehuda. Now, but David HaMelech, in addition to being the main trunk, before he became that main trunk, he was the small branch. Because David HaMelech is descended from Yehuda, right? So he first started out being what? A branch, and then the Rebbeinu Shalom gave him the main trunk also at the same time. So therefore, David HaMelech is both. He is the major trunk or the yesod, the foundation of the Mashiachos of David, and he's also the branch of David. He's got both at the same time. Therefore, any future individual who's a branch, we refer to it by the individual who has that branch, and that's David. You know, since David HaMelech was also a branch, so we refer to him, the Mashiach ben David, also we refer as Ben David only, because in other words, any person who has the branch, we call it by the individual who had the most significant part of that branch. That was David HaMelech. Even though David also had the main trunk, which was taken away from Yehuda. Yosef, however, had a son Ephraim. So who was the first branch in terms of Yosef? Ephraim, right? Ephraim was never given that major foundation like Yosef. So therefore, when you refer to the Mashiach, the truth is what he is really a branch, and you call him Ephraim, who is really the originator of all the branches. That's why. So the Mashiach ben Yosef is really referred to as Ephraim, because the Mashiach ben Yosef is really a branch. Even though he gets power from the neshama of Yosef, but he's still a branch. And therefore you call him Ephraim because the individual who is the first branch is Ephraim. The most significant branch is Ephraim. So he's called Ephraim, Mashiach ben Ephraim. Sometimes he's referred to as Mashiach ben Yosef because again, Yosef is the trunk which of course connects with the branch, which is Ephraim. Now, so that's in terms of Mashiach ben Yosef, why he's called Mashiach ben Ephraim, or referred to constantly as Ephraim. Whereas Mashiach ben David, of course, is David himself embodies both the Shirish HaProti and the Shirish HaKlori, the most significant Shirish HaProti. Therefore, we refer to the individual Mashiach ben David as Mashiach ben David, even though that individual is Mashiach ben David is really a Prat, a Shirish Proti. But we call him according to the individual who had the most significant Shirish Prati, so we call him again after that. It's like somebody being named after his father. So every individual who is a Shirish, a branch, is named after the individual who is either the first or the most important branch. So David had both. So it's Mashiach ben David either because of branch or because of trunk. Whereas Mashiach ben Yosef is only refers to the trunk, but Mashiach ben Yosef, who is the Mashiach, is really a branch. So he's called Ephraim. This is why you have that difference in names. So when you come across Ephraim, Mashiach Tzidki, or constantly Ephraim, you know Ephraim is the Mashiach ben Yosef, and they refer to him as Ephraim since he is really a branch. And later on he'll join with Yosef, but still, he's still a branch, even though he gets koyach from Yosef. This basically ends with the theoretical ideas of the Mashiachas. This ends, again, what I will say, the understandings that we must have to proceed further. I know it's been spiritual, this entire framework of this week and last week, in terms of the neshamas, the yechida and the neshama and the shroshim and Mashiach ben David, ben Ephraim and ben Yosef and so on. But it's very important to understand, because then one understands, like I said, what happens to civilization on a spiritual level as well as a physical level. Besides the fact that it's good to know, because most people have no idea at all about this altogether. So this idea is really very unique, whether you realize it or not. Now we'll return back to the original agenda, which is to go into history itself, and again to begin looking again at the evolvement of history and the themes of Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef as they occur, and how many different ideas become answered as a result of this knowledge. Now, if you recall, to go back, because probably people have lost track, remember that Adam did a chet, and as a result of that chet, there was a pagam or a kilkul, a damage in the bria. Besides the original deficiency that the universe had, there was a new damage, which Adam Rishon created, of course, by his chet. Now that damage, of course, needs a tikkun, that kilkul or damage. Besides the fact that the original chasar needs a tikkun. But certainly the damage that Adam Rishon did, that needs a correction. Okay? Now, as a result of that, you had different personalities in history trying to contend with this pagam or kilkul. And I had mentioned that you have, of course, Yosef HaTzadik went into Mitzrayim, Moshe Rabbeinu was in Golus, the Jews in Egypt, they suffered the Yisurin in Mitzrayim, of course, all for the idea, of course, of trying to be masak in that kilkul, to trying to undo the damage that Adam Rishon had done. Now, in looking at the Jews in Mitzrayim, I just wanted to mention certain important ideas. A person can wonder what was the task of the Jews in Mitzrayim, not only in terms of what they had to do, the objective, which I had mentioned was to remove that evil which was into the bria, that what's called zoyama, the poison of the nachash. The idea is that the Jews in Mitzrayim had two tasks, and if they would fulfill these two tasks, then they would remove the zoyama. What are these two tasks? The first is that they have to suffer at the hands of Egypt, which means that the Sitra Achra derives a certain amount of strength from the sins of mankind, and his representatives, of course, is those people who choose to do evil. So therefore, evil subdues good, and good suffers at the hand of evil until all the power is drained from evil, from which it derived from the sins of individuals, and good then vanquishes. That's where it goes. That the chatoim of the people before all the generations, in the times of Noach and so on, that they contributed heavily to the strength of the Sitra Achra. Therefore, the people who represent the Sitra Achra, and in that generation, of course, it was Egypt, will subjugate and inflict pain on those people who really represent Toiv. And there will come a point where the power that the Egypt derives from the sins of mankind is over. It's used them up. That's the end of its claim. And then that's a tikkun for the Zohar. It's gone. So therefore, the task of the Jew in Egypt, of course, was to suffer under Egypt in order to take away all the power of the Sitra Achra as it was represented by Egypt. And the second thing, but what was the Nisayan? Besides the Yisurin, the suffering that Jews had in Egypt, what was the Nisayan? The Nisayan was that the Jews cannot lose their identity. There were no mitzvahs in Egypt. The Nisayan of the Jews was that no matter how bad it gets, no matter how much suffering they go through, they cannot lose their identity in Egypt. And where do we see that they succeeded in that? Because it says that they did not change their names, their language, and their dress. Now if you'll notice, those three are the identity of a nation. When a nation changes the names, the language, and the dress, which means its culture, it's no more that nation that we know. That's how nations are identified. So that's what Chazal mean, that by not changing these three ideas, they did not lose their identity. They were still a Jew within Egypt. Jews within Egypt. Had they not done these things, then there would be no Jews anymore. There would be just Egyptians. So that's what's also meant by the idea that had the Jews had descended 49 levels of Tumah, like Egypt. Had they descended into the 50th, they could not have been redeemed. Why? Because that would have meant that there are no Jews to take out. They're all Egyptians. The Jews would have lost their identity and would have totally assimilated with Egypt. They would have adopted their names, their language, their dress, completely intermingled with Egypt. And of course, that would have been what that would have meant is that they are entering the Nun Shari Tumah, the 50th gate of Tumah. However, they came ad v'lo ad bichlal, means they came up to that level and they did not go into that level, fortunately. So therefore they maintained their identity as Jews. That was their nisayan, that no matter how many years you suffer, don't lose the identity of the Jew. And Yosef understood this. Yosef understood this. Why? Because when Yaakov and the sons came to Egypt, where did Yosef put them? He put them in Eretz Goshen, in a land which was a suburb of Egypt. He separated them from Egypt because he realized that if he puts them in Egypt, what's going to happen? They're going to become assimilated. So therefore Yosef separated them that they should maintain their identity no matter what Yisurin they go through. However, what does the Torah say? Vatimolei ha'oretz oisam. The entire land was filled with them, which means that the Jews were not staying in Goshen. They were beginning to go infiltrate all over Egypt. That's what it means, that the entire land was full with them. Vatimolei ha'oretz oisam, which means that they didn't stay in Goshen. They were now going into the major cities of Egypt, and so on. So therefore, this is the beginning of the entrance, of course, into the Shari Tumah. And they went all the way down till the end, Memtes, but they didn't go into the Nun. They maintained their identity. Therefore, they were worthy to be redeemed because they are Jews. They are a nation within a nation. Goy b'kerev Goy. They still could be called a different Goy b'kerev Goy. Had not, then they would be called, there's no Goy b'kerev Goy. It's only one Goy. It's only one nation. So therefore, this is the idea of the task of the Jews in Egypt, not to become assimilated, to maintain their identity. And that's what Chazal mean by the fact that they didn't change these three things. So therefore, they were able to maintain that, and therefore the Jews could be redeemed. And just as a side note, it says, Vatimolei ha'oretz oisam, the land was filled with them, right? And what does it say right after that? Vayokem melech chodosh, right? The Torah, and a new king arose that did not know Joseph. That's when the Shibud began, right? But that is put in right after Vatimolei ha'oretz oisam. So what the Torah is Megala a very important principle, that the Jews think that if they're separate from the Goyim, then the Goyim will hate them. Whereas if they mingle with the Goyim, then on the contrary, brotherly love, friendship, all this absurdity of especially what a lot of different organizations try to do, interfaith kind of stuff. Then on the contrary, the way to avoid anti-Semitism is to merge with Goyim, right? But if you stay away from them, it's no good. What does the Torah say? Vatimolei Aretz, and they merged with the Goyim, and what happened? Anti-Semitism begins when the Jew wants to fraternize with the Goy, not when he stays apart. The Torah is megala that in this juxtaposition, in the smichus of Vatimolei Aretz with Vayokem El Chodesh. That's an aside, since I brought down that pasuk. But the main idea is Vatimolei Aretz is what Torah is megala, that the Yidden are now beginning to go into the Shari Tumah. They begin to lose their identity very quickly. And of course, fortunately they didn't, and therefore they were redeemed. Now that we understand this, what becomes obvious also is, why did the Rebbeinu Shalom tell Avram Avinu that your people will be slaves or under the shibud in a nation that they don't know? Why did he tell him so many hundreds of years before at the Bris Ben Absarim? Why did he tell him that? And the answer is obvious, because at that point Avram Avinu entered into an agreement with the Rebbeinu Shalom, right? What was the agreement? That the Rebbeinu Shalom would give Avram Olam Haba if Avram would do his will, the Rebbeinu Shalom's will, the mitzvahs, right? This is what the agreement was. But part of the agreement is what? What is intrinsically bound up with that agreement? To remove the zoyam of the nochash, because that's exactly what the task is, to bring the creation back to its original state. That is part of the agreement, it's intrinsically involved. So therefore, when you sit down and make somebody a contract, what do? You state all the conditions or all the articles of the contract. One of the articles was that Jews, or Avram's descendants, must be in Egypt for a certain amount of time in order to remove that zoyama. Therefore, it was stated at the original time of the agreement. Because that is the agreement with Avram. That since you now take the agreement, which means to do the mitzvahs now, and the Rosh says he will give Olam Haba, the mitzvahs involve removing the zoyama, and that, of course, is Egypt. So therefore, it was very appropriate. It was the proper time to tell Avram, at the Bris Ben Absarim, at the time you made a covenant with Avram, that the agreement means that your descendants have to suffer in Egypt for a certain amount of time, to have the Yisurin and to maintain their identity, and that will remove the zoyama. Now we understand that. In other words, once we understand the idea of Mitzrayim as removing the zoyama, we understand why it was presented to Avram, because that's part of the agreement. Therefore, parts of the agreement have to be presented at the time you make an agreement, and not later. Now, to go further. So therefore, this is just to sort of like to summarize and just to add certain information that wasn't stated previously. So we are now at the point where the Jews have left Egypt, of course, and they have been successful. They removed the external influence of evil. In other words, they are now standing at Matan Torah successfully. And I had mentioned, of course, that the Egel restored the Zoyama. If you recall, that the Egel restored the Zoyama, and it also restored the original Pagam of Yosef to himself. If you recall, in terms of what I said, the Esatipus, the 10 drops, that Pagam was also restored because it had not been removed by the Inyan of Mitzrayim. It was all to naught in that sense, because evil now again became internalized in man. And I had gone through this previously. Now we begin to understand what that really means once we understand what a shirish is, a shirish Mashiach Ben Yosef, the trunk, shirish kloli, and so on. We understand much more now what a pagam to Yosef means. When Yosef was pogim himself, what does that mean? It means that he wasn't pogim the branch. The trunk was nivgam, right? Because Yosef was the trunk, not a branch. So because of those esatipus, it means that the trunk itself was nivgam. Well, it was a defect, a damage, which means that every individual who's a shirish the Mashiach Ben Yosef would have a pagam. Why? Because every branch, if the tree is defective, then every branch of that tree has a defect. Correct? It's all mirrored in the original branch. Therefore, it means that pagam is not just a pagam in Yosef, it's a pagam in every shirish proti, or every shirish of the Mashiach ben Yosef, all the way down all the generations. And what that would mean as a result of that since every branch is nivgam, not just the yesod, but the shroshim are all nivgam, it would mean that the individual who would be the Mashiach also has a pagam in his neshama. Same idea, correct? Because same thing. Now we begin understanding the significance of Yosef having that done to his yesod, because now you can analyze it differently since you see the spiritual makeup of the Mashiach. So what that would mean, and now we finally begin to understand what the Gemara means that the Mashiach ben Yosef will die at the hands of Goig or Armilus, as they call him. This is why. Because recall that if there's a pagam in the Mashiachos, what does that mean? It's a true chilul, which means that the Sitra Achra derives strength from that pagam in the Mashiachos itself, in the Yesod of Yosef itself, right? So that means that the Sitra Achra passes this koyach onto who? Onto people who represent evil. And in the end of the time of the Mashiach, it represents Goig or Armilus, as he's called. This individual represents the forces of all evil, and he derives his strength from the Sitra Achra, who derives his strength from the Pagam in Yosef's Neshama. Therefore, what it would mean now is that Armilus now can stop the Mashiach ben Yosef from doing what he wants to do, and must Yehudoi tremendously. That's why the Gemara says that the Mashiach ben Yosef will die. For that reason, in that sense. Because in that way, Armilus, who comes because of the strength of the Chet of Yosef, will be able to put an end to the descendants of Yosef. Although not for a long time. As soon as that happens, then of course, all the power that the Sitra Achra has, from which he got from the Chet of Yosef, is used up. So then along comes Mashiach ben David, of course, and slaughters the armies of Goig, and of course it was Armilus, and he kills the Sitra Achra, because it's only to use up that last koyach that he's able to kill the Mashiach when he is the Mashiach. And of course Mashiach ben David then corrects completely the inyan, and then right after that, of course, Mashiach ben Yosef is resurrected in Chiyas HaMesim. That's what should have happened, and I'm showing you the logic of why it should have happened. Because Armilus, who takes his power from the Sitra Achra, who takes his power from the Chet or the Pagam in the trunk, the Yesod of the Mashiach ben Yosef, and therefore gives it out to every Sherish, is able to stop the union of Mashiachus and able to Masti Yehuda, which is always what the Sitra Achra does. And I had mentioned that the greatest Hesti Yehuda that can be is when a Goy kills a Yid, right? Because it's an insult to the king, the Rebbeinu Shalom. And not only a Yid, when he kills a Tzaddik, that's the greatest Hester of all, because you think God would protect his righteous men. So therefore it's the greatest proof that the Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't exist, Chas v'Shalom, in that sense. The greatest Hester Yehudi of all. So Shtel Zechfor, if Armilus is successful in killing the Mashiach ben Yosef, the greatest Tzaddik of all time, imagine what kind of Hester Yehudi that would be. But that again is a tikkun for the Pagam of Yosef. This is what the Gemara in Sukkah means, that in Nach it was talking about the hesped of the Mashiach ben Yosef. But, however, things changed. as I'll show you that, and I had mentioned previously, that what the Rebbeinu Shalom did is he took that Pagam in every shirish, and instead of killing the Mashiach ben Yosef, he spread it out through thousands of years, which I had mentioned previously. And therefore the Mashiach ben Yosef won't die at the hands of Armilus, because that kind of Misa has been spread out to thousands of years. That pain, instead of doing it in one shot, has been distributed over many years. So each incident of suffering is not a suffering that could kill. Merely it damages, or it's severe in that sense. And I'll speak about that later on. But in any case, so therefore, that's what's meant when Yaakov said, Oid Yosef Chai. Yaakov thought Yosef died, right? He thought he died. And all of a sudden he finds out that Yosef did not die. On the contrary, he's Melech. He's Mamasheni the Melech, right? And he said, Oid Yosef Chai, Oid Yosef B'ni Chai. Yosef, my son, still lives. So that's Merames. This is what the Vilna Gaon says. That is Merames, that the Mashiach ben Yosef will not die. Oid Yosef ben Ichai, he's still alive. Because of the chesed, the Klal Yisrael, which I'll go into, why it was such a chesed? Because the tragedy would not have only been the Mashiach ben Yosef dying, but it would have been tremendous repercussions of Klal Yisrael. So therefore, Oid Yosef Chai means that the Mashiach ben Yosef yet lives, and Yaakov was Merames that. So he said, Yosef, my son, the shirish, the yisoid, the trunk, still lives, even with the pagam, and L'asad Lovoi, he will also live. There won't be any death. Mashiach ben Yosef will not die. So, what we've done is that we've come so far in understanding the spiritual structure of the Mashiach. Now you appreciate what that understanding does in understanding what's happening in history and how we understand Chazal, Mashiach ben Yosef dying and not. And that's why it was very important to give you this entire background. And again, next week I will proceed with the Inyanim which I had left off earlier, and we will go in further Inyanim of the events of the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David, and how history literally mirrors exactly what's going on.
What is the name?
Now, until now, what have we done? First, what's been described is the idea of Odom Harishon. We've explored what we're doing is exploring the idea of Mashiach. And what first has been developed is the ideas of the Mashiach as they emanate from Odom Harishon. That was the first shiur. After that, we went into the idea of Yosef and Yehuda, the development of the ideas of the Mashiach in Yosef and Yehuda. Then we went in the third shiur into the ideas of Moshe Rabbeinu and Klal Yisrael in Mitzrayim, again as expressions of the idea or the concepts of the two Mashiachim. And the last two shiurim was spent in giving you a structure, a ruchnistic structure, a spiritual structure of what is meant by the Mashiach, the Shroshim and the Anofim and so on. What really is meant by the ideas Mashiach on a spiritual, structural level. And of course, once we understand that, then we can of course begin to understand in terms of the Mashiach on earth what is really happening. Now today, what I want to do is continue to develop the framework, and that is that it's very important for us to understand what is the relationship between the ideas of Mashiach and the ideas of history, and also what is the relationship between these two ideas and the two anhogas of the Rabbeinu Shalom, which I'll get into, and I had mentioned previously, the idea of anhogas HaMishpat and the idea of anhogas HaYichud, which I had mentioned previously, but I'll be explaining these things. In other words, it's very important to continue the idea and to have a framework of exactly what is going on when we say that the Mashiach, the two ideas of the two Mashiach, is the underpinnings of the Bria in terms of the historical evolution or the historical sequence of man. What does it really mean? Now, until now we've been talking about the Mashiach, which is Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, as they manifest itself through history. And we've explored it in 3 different instances, or actually maybe 4. Odom, Cain v'Hevel, Yosef and Yehuda, Moshe in Mitzrayim. Now, we see that there are always 2 different kinds of events that happen in terms of the Mashiach. In terms of what we discussed previously, the different kinds of the situations we discussed previously, Odom, Cain v'Hevel, Yosef and Yehuda, and Moshe and the Yidden in Mitzrayim. And you'll notice that these 2 events concerning the 2 Mashiachim are the continuing theme or the continuing understanding of all history, especially of all different things that happen to Jews. In other words, there are 2 kinds of basic ideas that history is always accommodating itself to. Historical events are always expressing these 2 ideas as relates to the ideas of the Mashiach. What are these ideas that continue to go through history constantly? And like I said, history accommodates or shapes itself to give rise to these two ideas, or to allow these two ideas to happen. The first is called the avodah of the Mashiach, the two avodas of the Mashiach. What is that? Avodah means the tasks. What is the task of the Mashiach? If you recall, everything started from the Chet of Adam Rishon, that the task of Adam was to reveal the fact of God's unity in the Bria, to Megali Yehuda throughout the entire universe. Not to contend with evil in the sense that he's got to fight evil within, but to reject evil, the advances of evil, and to Megali Yehuda throughout the Bria. This was basically the task of Adam Rishon. As a result of this Chet, evil now was internalized in the universe, and it now has a shlita, it has a control over all physical reality. So therefore the task of man became twofold: to reveal God throughout the universe, and the second is to remove the Yetzer Hara, the Sitra Achra, from the Bria, to actually fight in the same arena as a Sitra Achra, to battle him and to throw him out. And then once you've thrown him out of the house, then to clean the house up with everything. It's very similar. In fact, let me just elaborate on the example of the house. It's like you have a house which is dirty, and then somebody comes in who's a filthy beggar. So you really have two jobs. One is to throw the beggar out because he keeps polluting your house, and then to clean up the house itself until it's all spotless. The same idea with Adam. Adam really should have cleaned the house, which means he should have removed the obstacles to being Masig Yehuda. That's the dirt, the obstacles that keep man from seeing it. Instead, what he did was he allowed a beggar to come in who told him that, look, let me help you clean up the house. So he allowed a beggar to come in who's full of lice and fleas and so on. So now he's got two things to contend with: to throw the beggar out, to throw this individual who brings all the lice and so on and disease with him, and then once he's got him out, to again clean the house because he realizes his error. That's a simple example. The same idea. Adam should have removed or just clean the house, reject evil, and clean the house means to megal the yichur of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And second thing, and that's all he should have done, instead he allowed the evil to enter the house to pollute further the idea that God is one in the universe. So now he's got to throw out the evil, or that message that the evil Sitra Achra gives, and then he's got to proclaim it throughout the entire universe. That's basically always the two tasks. One is called, of the Mashiach, one is called Kfiyas Hara Tachas HaKedusha, to subjugate the evil underneath holiness, means to throw him out. And the second thing is Hispashtus HaKedusha V'chol Madrigoseho, to be Mispashit the Kedusha, to spread the holiness, to spread the idea of the Yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout all creation. That's the second idea. So these are the two. This is one of the two tasks that we see in history, which is the avodah of the Mashiach. The first avodah is to what? Is to remove evil, to subjugate evil. The second task of the Mashiach is to proclaim the yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout all creation. That's one theme that goes through history. The second theme that goes through history is the attempt by the Rebbeinu Shalom, after the first task has been done, to bring the Yemais Mashiach. That's the second thing that you find through history. That after people will have, after the idea that the first task will be done, that evil will have been removed from the Bria, and also that Kedusha means that the unity of the Rebbeinu is now proclaimed throughout the Bria. The second thing that can happen now is the Yemais Mashiach can be ushered in. So therefore we find that these two tasks, subjugating evil and spreading Kedusha, is one task, means it's one theme, and the second thing is to bring the Yemais Mashiach, bring the Messianic age. We find that these two things are always going on through history, A and B. A with its subcategories of 1 and 2, namely to control or subjugate evil, and then to spread the Kedusha or the idea of Yichud, the truth of the nature of the Rebbeinu throughout the Bria. That's one task. And the second thing is, of course, is the is the fact that Yosef Mashiach is always attempting to be ushered in. Whenever you look at history, you always find these two things going on, as I'll be more explicit later. You find the fact that some person or group of individuals, or Klal Yisrael in general, is trying to remove the Sitra Achra, contend with the Sitra Achra, remove them. Then the other part of that task is then to spread the true nature of the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the Bria, to Megala that. And the second task, which you find going through history, is the attempts by the Rebbeinu Shalom to bring the Moshe Mashiach in. So therefore we see that there are two basic themes or threads that wind itself through history. The two tasks of the Mashiach is one, and the idea of ushering the Moshe Mashiach is two. Now, we see that so far in the previous shiurim. We see the attempts at bringing in Yemoshe Mashiach. The first attempt was Adam Rishon, as was mentioned. The next attempt was Cain v'Hevel. And the next attempt after Cain v'Hevel was Moshe Rabbeinu and the Jews of Mitzrayim. All three events were of the type that tried to bring the Yemoshe Mashiach in. Of course, each one of these individuals in these events was involved in the tasks of the Mashiach, namely to subjugate evil and to spread the word or spread the nature of the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the Bria. That was Adam Harishon's job. Then Cain and Hevel, there was that duality where Hevel took the Ben David's part to spread the idea or to be masik the Yichud Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the Bria, and Cain's part to remove Oivir Adama, to remove the idea of the Sitra Achra and the Bria. We find that they were involved literally in those two works. Adam, of course, wasn't involved in those two works because when he was created, there was only one job to do. After him began the idea of two. So we find that Cain and Hevel again were involved in those two avodas, and in addition, they could have ushered in the Yemoshe Mashiach. Adam, of course, was involved only in the first avodah, but had he been successful, the hispashtus of Kedusha throughout the Bria, then he would have ushered in the Yemoshe Mashiach. And we find the third attempt to bring the Mashiach, of course, was by the Jews Mitzrayim with Moshe Rabbeinu. And they were also involved in those two jobs. One is to subjugate evil, as a result, subjugate evil by being in Mitzrayim, which I'll explain. And the second was, of course, was to be mispashit Kedusha, which they would have done had they received the Torah the way they should have. That's the whole idea of the 49 days. That was once they've subjugated evil by destroying Egypt, they would have had, then they had 49 days to receive the Torah. That was the hispashtus of Kedusha. That was now realizing more and more the nature of the Rebbeinu Shalom, until Matan Torah would have been the revelation of that nature. That's the other flip side of the coin. First, to contend with Egypt, and second, to reveal the nature. And had that, of course, been successfully realized, then Yemoshe Mashiach, which is the second major event theme, would have been ushered in. And as I mentioned, Moshe would have been Mashiach Ben Yosef, and the whole Yemoshe Mashiach would have been ushered in. There would have been then Mashiach Ben David. And of course, that also failed. Now, so we see therefore that the attempts to bring the Mashiach, the true Mashiach, we've seen it already done 3 times, and each one of them, of course, was always involved in the labor of the Mashiach. We also see the attempts at the two avodas were also done by the Mashiach. And that is, we see it was done by, which I'll explain, which I have explained. There's Avram, was one attempt, again, of fighting the Sitra Achra and maintaining Kedusha. There was Yitzchak, there was Yaakov and Esav. There was Yaakov after Esav lost or gave up his chelik. Then there was Yosef and Yehuda also. So therefore we see that the avodah that is always taking place in this world, in history, is to contend oneself with the Sitra Achra, then to reveal the nature of God after the Sitra Achra has been removed. That's one avodah, and this has been shared by many individuals. Then there's always the attempt to bring the Yemoshe Mashiach after those two tasks have been completed, after the tikkunim have been done. So we see that there are many individuals who are involved in that duality, and there were 3 attempts to bring the Yemoshe Mashiach. This is what we've seen until now. this is so this is our of course, our understanding until now of the two themes that go through our history. Always attempting to correct the situation, tikkunim, by removing the sitra achra and then spreading the kedusha or the hasog of Yehuda throughout. And the second theme of history is always trying to bring the Mashiach, assuming those tasks have been complete. And we've seen it illustrated until the end of Moshe Rabbeinu. Of course, the shiurim after this will be going into again those two themes and how we see them continuing with Rechavam and Yerovim, and then of course in terms of Purim and by Ezra and Nehemiah, then Chanukah, then Rebbe Akiva and his Chaverim, and then the idea of the Golus. So literally we see that all these have been going on for almost 6,000 years, these two themes. Now, let's look into it more deeply. And once we understand this, we understand the connection between history and that which the Rebbeinu Shalom does in terms of his activities, and also why are these the specific tasks that the Mashiach has to do? What's the real understanding of that? These ideas are very fundamental, and the truth is that if one has a grasp of the rest of the shiur, then you really have the basic ideas of all Jewish history and world history, and it's really a matter of just applying it. Now, there are two principles that really determine historical events, and I had spoken about the first one in the 12th shiur that I gave. This was last year, but I'll bring it down here because now we can really begin to understand what history is really based on and how it relates to the different hanhogos of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and how these relate to the whole idea of these two themes always going through history. The idea of, as I mentioned, ridding oneself of the Ra, being Mispasha Kedusha, and the second idea, of course, of ushering in Yemais Mashiach. I'm going to try to relate all three ideas. Now, there are basically two principles that determine history. All history, Jewish history, world history, and whatever other history you want to study, revolves itself around two principles. And all history must reflect those principles, and they are incredibly accurate, and different events happen in order to bring to fruition these principles. The first idea is the idea that history must reflect the amount of Hester and Gilui in the Bria. Hester and Gilui in the Bria, concealment and revelation in the Bria. What does that mean? If you recall that the Jew, and before the Jewish nation, all men, that was the idea of Adam, and then after Avram, only the Jew had this power. If you recall, the Jew has the awesome power of bringing the revelation of the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom into the Bria. He can do it, and I had gone through this previously in terms of what Simsim was in previous shiurim. But the Jew has the power of bringing a greater presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Bria, and that means that there's a greater hisgalus of yichud. The world somehow recognizes the unity of God far greater. How does the Jew do that? He does it through mitzvahs. Through the mitzvah, the Jew, and I mentioned before the relationship between the mitzvah and the fact that the Rebbeinu Shalom comes in and out of the Bria before. But the idea is that through the mitzvah, the Jew can actually megala the yichud, and that's actually what he does with the mitzvah. He testifies to unity. And as a result of his testimony, the Rebbeinu Shalom acts mida k'neged mida. You revealed my unity, I will now enter the Bria even more, and you will see my presence more. God works at the hands of man. Man brings God in, or man keeps him out. Jews now. Yeah, Jews now. Now, in other words, mitzvahs, which being a testimony of God's unity, brings the Rebbeinu Shalom into the Bria. The sins of Jews does the reverse. Every sin that a Jew does declares his own uniqueness, means a Jew's own uniqueness, and not God's uniqueness, because he's doing his own will, not God's will. So in effect, the Jew is saying that there are many different beings besides you, there's also myself. So therefore, the Jew, by doing an avera, is masti yechudai. in that effect, he keeps God out of the universe. He rejects the Rebbeinu Shalom from entering the Bria, because the Rebbeinu Shalom is Mida Keneged Mida. You insist on seeing yourself as an independent being. Therefore, I will hide my true unity, and you will be under that illusion that you're somebody also. So it always works like a seesaw. Now, in any case, or rather, it's always a reciprocity. Now, therefore, the Hester in the Gilui of Yehuda, as a result of Chatoim and the mitzvahs of Jews, is manifest in the Bria through historical events. In other words, history changes in order to reflect the amount of Hester or Gilui present. History must change to reflect the amount of Hester or Gilui present. Therefore, if the Jews sin, therefore somehow things get worse. In other words, events which obstruct the revelation of God's unity happens in the universe, happens in this world. If the Jews do mitzvahs, then those events which promote the belief of God and the understanding of His true nature as an absolute unity, they are given success. And all of this, of course, is contingent on the actions of a Jew. So therefore, history is the last repercussion of what happens when the Jew does the Avodah. So it's a chain reaction. The Jew does the Avodah. Either he does the Avodah, mitzvahs, or he does Chatoim, Averes. The next chain reaction after that is God therefore conceals Himself from the universe, so it looks as if He is out of the universe. Or He brings Himself into the universe. He reveals Himself more to the Bria. The next chain reaction is, how does it manifest itself back into this world? It manifests itself that events either those events which are trying to promote the belief of God and worship of God and His unity have success, or those events which try to obstruct that knowledge, they try to introduce atheism and so on, or keneged the yichud of Rebbeinu Shalom, they have success. That is exactly how the chain event, the chain reaction works. Now, if Yidden do Chatoim, and therefore God absents Himself from the Bria, therefore history reflects itself in terms of the obstructing that knowledge of God, how does that manifest itself in concrete terms? Well, you begin to see the rise of atheism, which is exactly, of course, what's happened. People begin to believe in other gods, which is Avodah Zarah. Again, this is all connected to the unity of the Rebbeinu Shalom. In addition to that, many powers are realized. In other words, everybody begins to think that he's somebody because everybody seems to be successful. The Goyim, the nations of the world who basically represent evil, okay, they are tremendously successful. So therefore the illusion of Ribui Kochos is given more prominence. The illusion that there are many forces and powers, there are many beings that can actually accomplish things and are the true causes, they of course proliferate, this illusion. So that's the third thing that happens in the Bria. The fourth thing is that the man begins to involve himself only in his own fulfillment, his need fulfillment. Therefore, he begins to become very narcissistic and very selfish. In other words, when a person begins to believe that he is somebody, then the next thing is, well, if I'm somebody, let me do what I want to do. What do I want to do? I want to fulfill my needs. So the next thing that happens after these three, or during these three, is that a person begins to involve himself, since he thinks he is omnipotent, he begins to involve himself in his own fulfillment of needs, and you begin to see, of course, narcissism, love of self, and selfishness, which is exactly really what's happening today. And then you begin to see true evil. Actually, narcissism itself is evil. Anytime man believes in his own greatness, that's evil. But you begin to see evil the way people think of evil also coming up, where man begins to interfere with other men in order to satisfy their own needs. And that means robbery, murder, and so on. All evil acts, the way we understand evil, is nothing more than the fact that another person is somehow interfering in your life, robbing you, killing you, maiming you, rape, whatever, in order to fulfill his own needs. And that, of course, is started because man then occupies himself with his own needs. And that is started because man believes that he's omnipotent. And that, I'm working my way backwards. And that has started because the proliferation of the concept of Rigvur Koiches exists, because everybody's given Hatzlacha. And that has started because there's a Hester of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And that has started because of the Chatoim of the Yidden. You see that whole chain reaction?
Yeah.
That's the way it works. In other words, it comes out that man gets the lifestyle of history reflects exactly all the way back to that chain reaction through the mitzvahs of the Jews or the chatoim of the Jews. That's how great is the force or the power of Yidden. Now, once we understand that, we now understand the idea of how this principle of history is Hanhogas HaMishpat. What is Hanhogas HaMishpat? Hanhogas HaMishpat means that if you want to know why does God do things, He does things for two reasons only. It can be boiled down to one of two reasons. Either it's Hanhogas HaMishpat or Hanhogas HaYichud. What is Hanhogas HaMishpat? Hanhogas HaMishpat means the conduct that is based on the attribute of justice. Hanhoga means the conduct or the behavior that is based on the attribute of justice. What does that mean? In other words, that means that what man does, man decides what history is. In other words, Jews do a chet, God removes himself, proliferation of the illusion of forces, man becomes narcissistic, he becomes even more evil. All this is the repercussion of the Jews' actions. So therefore God is merely bringing the universe to reflect the actions of the Jews. Chatoim. That's Hanhogas HaMishpat. The Rebbeinu Shalom is allowing man to determine the form of history. So therefore, when history is now being moved because of the Rebbeinu Shalom, in the sense that it reflects man's action, that's Hanhogas HaMishpat. If it was the reverse, if Yidden did mitzvahs, then God would busy himself with making sure that the universe reflects good things, things which promote the idea that the absolute unity of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So it comes out that Hanhogas HaMishpat is the actual conduct of the Rebbeinu Shalom, which means that the Hester and the Gilu of Yichud, as manifested in history, is a direct repercussion of man's actions. In other words, man creates, as a result of man's actions, history reflects those actions in this entire chain reaction. This is Hanhogas HaYichud. In other words, Hanhogas HaMishpat. That's right, which I just explained. Justice. Now, therefore we see that the principle of Tov LeTovim and Ra LeRoim is Hanhogas HaMishpat. In other words, when God acts as a result, in consequence of man's actions, and does exactly what the significance of man's actions is, we say God is acting in terms of the conduct of Mishpat. What determines God's actions is justice, which means your actions demand another one. So therefore, those people who are Tov LeTovim, those people who are good, get good. God makes sure those people who are good, who do mitzvahs, get good. Those people who are Ra, get evil. So it's Tov LeTovim, Ra LeRoim. Good for the people who do good, and bad, evil punishment for those people who do bad. This is what Hanhogas HaMishpat is. That is the first principle that history mirrors or accommodates itself to. The second principle that history accommodates itself to, and now we begin to understand the ideas of Mashiach, is called Hanhogas HaYichud. If you recall, what Hanhogas HaYichud is, it is when God does actions based on His absolute unity. What does that mean? If you recall that the Rebbeinu Shalom has given three different ways that the Jews can bring the Rebbeinu Shalom back into the Bria. And He did that as a chesed, if you recall. Because if He only had one way, if you failed, it's all over. So He gave you three. That if you failed in one, you have two other ways. The first way you can bring the Rebbeinu Shalom back into the Bria and thereby affect history is mitzvahs. If you don't do mitzvahs, you do chatoim, you still have another way called tshuva. And if you don't do tshuva, there's a third way called yisurin, pain. Therefore, the Rebbeinu Shalom in His chesed provided three different mechanisms by the way a Jew can bring the Rebbeinu Shalom back into the world, and automatically history must reflect itself, mirror those changes. Now, so therefore, what Hanhogas HaYichud really is what? It's a backup system. In other words, Hanogas Yichud means the actions that God does in order to make sure that the Jews are Zeichet Ilam Haba, in order to make sure that the world again reflects the unity of the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is Hanogas Yichud. And I mentioned previously, why is it called Yichud? Because it shows the absolute supreme authority of God, that He even overrules justice. That even though the Jews don't deserve Olam Haba, they don't deserve that the Rebbeinu Shalom comes back into the Bria, the Rebbeinu Shalom is Machadish a new Anhoga, that He provides a backup system. That even though they don't do it on their own, I will do it for them. And that is Merumas really in Ashrei. Because it says there in Gemara Brachos in the Avdal Lamed Beis that it says, why isn't there a Nun in Ashrei? Ashrei has every letter of the alphabet. Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Each pasuk is from Aron Mimcha, B'chol Yom, Godel Hashem, and so on. Each letter has a verse, each verse has one of the oasis of the Aleph Beis following it. So the Gemara says there's no Nun, because there's a pasuk that says, Noflo Lo Yosef, that Klal Yisrael has fallen, Lo Yosef kum besulas Yisrael. The virgin Israel will no more rise. So therefore, David HaMelech didn't want to put that in to Ashrei, because Amos was prophesying that Israel will fall and never arise. However, so what the Gemara says, that after it became David, he saw Baruch HaKodesh, what Amos would say, and he put what will happen, what the true meaning of Amos's words is. And he put that in the next pasuk. Instead of Nun, he put in Samach, Simach Hashem l'chol ha'neflim v'zikach l'chol ha'ktufim. What does that mean? That the Rebbeinu Shalom will pick up all those that fall. And he's referring to Klal Yisrael. So what David HaMelech was telling you about, what Amos is going to say in the future, is Baruch HaKodesh, that Klal Yisrael can no more rise, doesn't mean that they will no more rise. That there will be a time when Anhogas HaMishpat, through Anhogas HaMishpat, they don't deserve to rise anymore. That they cannot rise by their own actions. Therefore, Simach Hashem l'chol ha'neflim, that God will lift those people who fell. Hanhogas HaYichud. That's what David HaMelech was merames. That the Nun from Amos, that no more will Klal Yisrael rise, that the Virgin of Israel has fallen, no more will it rise, means through Hanhogas HaMishpat, Klal Yisrael can no more rise, because they're not worthy for Olam Haba. But Simach Hashem l'chol ha'neflim, but since there's another Hanhoga called Hanhogas HaYichud, where God circumvents or overthrows, in that sense, Hanhogas HaMishpat, they will arise. But of course, Klal Yisrael can only get Olam Haba only through Mishpat. But it means that, look, if you don't do your job, I'll make you do your job. But the only way you can get Olam Haba is doing your job. So either you do it on your own initiative, or I'm going to make you do your job. That's the Hanhogas HaYichud. So it shows Yichud that the Rebbeinu is over, the supreme authority over Mishpat. That even though you don't deserve to your own ma'asim to get Olam Haba, the Rebbeinu will make you deserve Olam Haba through Yisurin. That's what the David HaMelech is merames that in Ashrei. Now, therefore we see, that's what Hanhogas HaYichud is. In the idea of Yisurin, that if mitzvahs and tshuva fail, therefore Yisurin is the new operative mechanism that goes. Therefore, the conduct that determines, or the principles that determines God's actions, which make sure the Jews get Olam Haba, is called Hanhogas HaYichud. But incredibly enough, Hanhogas HaYichud doesn't operate independently of Hanhogas HaMishpat. What did we say? That when Klal Yisrael does Chatoim, what happens to the Bria? There's a tremendous proliferation of evil, right? There's more goyim, there's more narcissism, there's more atheism, more avodah zarah, right? There's more evil, robbery, and so on, decay of civilization. That's the result of Mishpat, the Jews' Chatoim. So what does the Rebbeinu Shalom do? He allows that itself to provide the Yisurin for the Jews, which gives them Olam Haba. So it comes out that the consequences of the Jews' actions itself is the agent for their own Yeshua. That's the iluyus of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And that's where Mishpat and Yichud intertwine. So it comes out that if Zot of Hanhogas HaMishpat, that Nebuch, all the Goyim are so powerful, the Goyim themselves, through their own power, will afflict the Jews, and the Jews therefore will get Olam Haba as a result of Yisurim. That's the incredible intertwining. Why does the Rebbeinu Shalom provide such an illusion shechap? That the Mishpat of the Eden itself provides their own Yeshua, that the Goyis miyasa the Yidden, therefore they fulfill the Asurin, the third mechanism, and they get Ilam Haba. Why does the Rebbe do that? Besides the fact that it's an incredible unity of two Anhagas, and the Rebbe always works through unity, his actions are always unity, but it's also to show you who the Sitra Achra, the incredible might of God, that the Sitra Achra is trying to destroy the Eden, so instead he becomes the very agent for their salvation. Stell sich vor that the Rebbe is such an Eloi that he fooled the Sitra Achra, which shows that the opposing force to God, which is a Sitra Achra, that tries to introduce the notion of plurality in the Bria, itself was the very agent to promote unity in the Bria, to make sure that Klal Yisrael gets Olam Haba. Stell sich vor what's really going on in the Bria. So therefore we see that in the end the Sitra Achra is going to turn around and he's going to say, I don't believe this. Here I thought that the Yidden were doing Chatoim, and on the contrary I'm making sure that all the nations are strong to miyasa the Jews, to destroy them, and it comes out that I was the very shliach of the Rebbe Shalom to save the Jews. This is incredible. This is what the Sitra Achra is going to realize, and that of course is the greatest testimony of Yehuda of all. That even the force which represents the plurality of God, to promote the plurality of God, the multiplicity of God, is the very force that in the end promotes the unity of the Rebbe Shalom by being the Rebbe Shalom's or Klal Yisrael's very agent to bring Klal Yisrael to the Geula. This is the idea of Hanogas Yichud, how it functions itself through Ra, and to promote the greatest Hasagas Yehuda also. There's also other reasons why it has to go through Ra, so the Sitra Achra is not aware himself of what he's doing, because if he was, he would probably stop it, and Adraba, he would make sure the Goyim are not miyasa the Yidim. So in order to hide it from the Sitra Achra, the Rebbe Shalom uses Sitra Achra himself to bring Yichud to the world. Now, in other words, Toiv le'Toivim is, and Ra le'Roim is Anhogas HaMishpat, because they get what they deserve, good for good, bad for bad. Toiv to le'Tzadikim and Ra le'Rishoyim is Anhogas HaYichud. That happens in order to make sure that Klal Yisrael is Zoicha to Olam Haba. That switch off is the second Anhoga, which David is Meramis, okay, which is one of the most fundamental operations in all history, to make sure that the Yidden get Olam Haba. But it has to go through Yisurim, through the Sitra Achra himself that brings it. So he is not aware of it, and it's also the greatest testimony of the Jews. Now, once we the testimony, of the Yehudai. Now, once we understand that we now understand the second fundamental principle of history, which is Anhogas HaYichud. But we now understand how it actually comes through the greatness of the Goyim. The hispashtus of the Sitra Achra brings the Anhogas HaYichud. We understand this now. What does that mean? We now see that the second greatest principle is that everything is a tikkun in order to mesakin the chatoim of the Jews and to correct mesakin the hester that was the result of that chet. Everything is a tikkun for that idea. Therefore history, to correct, to modify, to rectify, therefore history expresses itself in those tikkunim. Therefore, history is now going to have two things. It's going to be the result of the chatoim or the mitzvahs of the Jews. And if the Jews sin, then history will reflect, of course, the hester of the Jews' sin. And the hester itself of the Jews' sin is going to bring about the Yeshua. So therefore, history will also reflect itself, that it must reflect the tikkunim going on. The way history is helping the Jews also, and that is through the Yisurin and so on, which I'm going to elaborate on now. Now, basically, the ones who are involved in the tikkunim, and therefore history reflects itself, and we're now going to see concretely how, the ones who are involved in the tikkunim, the correction of the chatoim and the hester of Jews, right, is the shroshim of the Mashiach. That's Shroshim, the roots of the Mashiach, Ben Yosef and Ben David, right? the actual Mashiachim themselves, those people who become the Mashiach, and all Klal Yisrael in general, all three are involved in bringing about the tikkun, which will undo the chatoim and the hester of the Jews. Now, how does it happen? Now we have to go back and understand what I meant, why the Mashiachim do these two kinds of jobs. You recall? There are two types of themes through history, if you recall, in the Mashiachim. Now we begin to see that those two types of themes in the Mashiachim is the themes of tikkunim. Besides the theme of Hanogas and Mishpat, which determines history, there are now two themes in history which goes under the rubric of Hanogas and Yichud, right? Which are the two tikkunim in history as a result of the Mashiachim. What are they? What was mentioned is the Kfiyas Horah Tachas HaKdusha, to go into the evil nation, to go into the arena and combat the evil, right? And that itself is further subdivided into two kinds of tasks. One is to suffer under that nation, because you're in the nation, right? You're combating. Combat consists of two different strategies: to suffer under that nation, and to fight to remain a tzaddik in that nation. Two tasks, two ways of combating the Sitra Achra, which is one of the ways, Bechlal, of the tikkunim of the entire idea of Mashiach, the Shroshim, the Mashiach themselves, and Klal Yisrael. Those are the subjects. Okay? The second way is not to combat the Sitra Achra, but is the hispashtus of Kedusha throughout the entire Bria. That also is done by the Mashiachim, by the Shroshim, and by Klal Yisrael. It means not to combat the Sitra Achra, but to proclaim the unity of God throughout the universe. Now, I'll go to the second one first, because that's disappeared basically. That was done by the Yidden when? When was that done historically? When the Jews did not contend with the Goyim, but instead what they did was proclaim the unity of God. In the days of what? In the days of Shlomo HaMelech, it was peace throughout the world. Therefore the whole tachas of the Jews was what? To mispash the Kiddush as much as possible. The Dor HaMidbar of Moshe Rabbeinu, again you find that. The Jews also, when they were in their own land, in the Beis HaMikdash, although it began to slowly deteriorate because they were always subjects of nations, was also to mispash the Kedusha. After the Churban Bayis Sheni, this method is no more. That the Jews' task is no more to mispash the Kedusha Be'ika. That is now reigned for the Yemoisa Mashiach. What remained is the second task, which has always been functioning and now remains solely. That is to combat the Sitra Achra in his own territory. Right? And we said that there are two ways of combating the Sitra Achra. First way is what? Is Yisurun, to suffer in the Sitra Achra. The second is to maintain your tzidkus in the throes of the Sitra Achra. Then that's combating. Then you remove the influence of evil. Then the Jews can take themselves to the next task of Espashtis Kedusha, which will be in Yemoisa Mashiach. But as I mentioned, after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, the first task of the Mashiachim, which is shared by all Klal Yisrael and the Goyim themselves, becomes prominent. And the second one now goes down. Remember, both tikkunim, or especially the combating the Sitra Achra in the Sitra Achra, in the nations, is part of Hanhogas HaYichud. Therefore, Hanhogas HaYichud now has prominence in the first task of the Mashiachim, to combat the Sitra Achra. When Jews are mispashit Kedusha, it's much more, of course, than Hanhogas HaMishpat, because that's doing it ayidei mitzvahs and tshuva. It's Yisurin that's especially prevalent in Hanhogas HaYichud, and the first task of the Mashiachim, to combat. And I mentioned that in combating evil there are two, Yisurin and Tzidkus. What does that really mean?
What is that?
Righteousness, to remain a tzaddik, even though you're in the Sitra Achra, or the nation of the Sitra Achra. What's important to understand now is, what does the Sitra Achra consist of? Two ideas. The Sitra Achra takes his strength to promote evil, Hester Yehudai, through the Chatoim of the Jews. That's how he takes his koyach. And the second is that there are 70 different ways that the Sitra Achra can promote evil. Therefore, there are 70 nations that are under the Sitra Achra each one promoting evil or Hester Yehudoi by its own way. Therefore, the Jews have to go through all Golas, all 70 nations. Why? And they must do two things in those 70 nations. One is they must suffer at the hand, the Yisurin. What that does is when the Jews suffer at the hands of the Goy, it takes away all the claim that the Goy has against the Jew. It depletes the energy of the Goy, which means it depletes the energy of the Sitra Achra, who gives the nations their koyach because they represent them. So therefore, when the Jews suffer at the hands of 70 nations, they take away the power of each nation, which means they take away the power of the Sitra Achra. And when they maintain their tzidkus, what they do is they take each unique method of each nation to promote evil. Instead, they promote good with it. So they use the method to magal yechudah of the Rabbanu Shalom. That's the idea of the Jews in Golos of 70 nations, suffering and remaining tzaddikim, because the Yisurin takes away the koyach of the Sitra Achra of each nation. And the second thing is that it takes each nation's uniqueness, and instead of promoting evil or Hester Yehudoi, it promotes Gil Yehudoi. And I'll give you one concrete example. America. One of the uniquenesses of America to promote Hester Yehudoi is technology. That through science, Goyim believe that they are the mighty ones, that they are atheistic. So therefore they use science and technology to foster the idea of minus, apikosis, that science is God, there is no other God. What does the Jew use? He uses technology to learn Torah, Adrabah. He uses technology, air conditioning, so he can sit and learn, and it's more cool. He uses technology, Adrabah, to see Yehudoi in the Bria. By studying that technology and realizing that Adrabah, it's all harmonious and it all reflects the incredible harmony of the Rabbanu Shalom in the Bria. Therefore we see that the Golos through 70 nations gives the Jews the opportunity of taking away the koyach and using the uniqueness of each nation to magal Yehudoi. That is the sum total of the combat Tachas Hara, which is the whole Tachas of the Mashiach Ben Yosef. So therefore we see two principles of history. The first principle is Anhogas HaMishpot, which means history reflects itself in terms of the amount of Hester and Yichud in the Bria, which reflects itself, of course, the Chatoim, the mitzvahs of Jews. And the second thing it reflects itself is that history now does to the Jews is puts them under the Ra to make sure that they will suffer and also take away the uniqueness of each nation. That's the tikkunim of the Mashiach. Therefore, it comes out that the Mashiach's tikkunim is really the entire thing that's going on in 2,000 years of history. That the second principle of history is really Anogas HaYichud, which is the entire tafkidim of the Mashiach. Tikkunim, that is to be under the Sitra Achra through Yisurim and main tzidkus. And the second thing, of course, is to be Mispash the Kedusha. So therefore the first is Ben Yosef, Mashiach Ben Yosef, and the second, of course, is Mashiach Ben David.